From her own yellow delicious apple tree in Burlington, Iowa, Mrs. Fred Curts picked 7 apples that will go into a pie. All other pie makers, now please stand aside, for this will be the latest competition entry by Mrs. Fred Curts of Burlington, Iowa, America's champion cook. One cup of sifted flour, 1/3 cup of shortening, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and enough milk to make a dough. Easy as apple pie. That's what it is, apple pie. Sprinkle the dough with flour. Roll to 1/4 inch thickness. Prepare the bottom crust in a pie plate. Seal it with egg white to avoid a soggy crust. Pre-bake the crust in a 375-degree oven for 10 minutes. This is the American tradition, apple pie. But there is something special about this particular pie. Watch. Mrs. Curts peels and cuts her apples into quarters. She adds 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon, 2/3 cup of sugar, puts it atop the apple quarters. Dots with butter, sprinkles with brown sugar, and 1/2 cup of cream. Yes, this apple pie is different. Mrs. Curts bakes it in a 375-degree preheated oven for 45 to 60 minutes. It comes out bubbling hot, spicy sweet, a pie of pies. A greased muffin pan heralds a batch of Mrs. Curts' championship muffins, and a chance for you to glimpse some of her cooking secrets. 2 cups of all-purpose flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, sifted and then mixed with 1 cup of sweet milk, 1 egg, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 4 tablespoons of sugar, and 4 tablespoons of melted shortening. She beats only enough to mix well. Does this lively working widow of the Midwest look like a typical American housewife in her busy kitchen? That she does. She has no servants, no trick equipment, no fancy tools to work with. She bakes her muffins in a preheated 425-degree oven for 15 to 20 minutes. The results are beautiful to see and magnificent to eat. Mrs. Curts has won more blue ribbons for her foods than any woman in American history. Easy fudge, she calls it. For her sweet-toothed friends who are continually dropping in, Mrs. Curts chops 1 cup of nuts. She heats 1/3 cup of evaporated milk and 2 tablespoons of butter in a pan. She takes it from the range and stirs in a half cup of cocoa, 1 pound of sifted powdered sugar, a few drops of cream, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, and the chopped nuts. She stirs it well, and that's it. No cooking at all. Just a little treat to slip in between more serious creations. Like her peach cobbler, Mrs. Curts measures 1 cup of flour as carefully as any teenage home ec student. She reads her own recipes with care, never tries to memorize them. 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 3/4 of a cup of sugar, half a cup of milk, a pinch of salt, all go into the batter together for beating. Now she peels and slices peaches from her farm near Montrose, Iowa. She fills a baking dish with them. Then she sweetens them. Adds 2 tablespoons of flour and dots with butter. Now Mrs. Curts pours the batter over the peaches and bakes it 45 minutes in a moderate oven. Mrs. Curts likes to peek, especially at her peach cobbler, because just before it's done, she adds a 1/4 cup of brown sugar and a tablespoon of butter. Mrs. Curts grows most of her own fruit for baking and preserving, and most of the vegetables. Occasionally, she enters her flowers in competition in the countless county, state, and national fairs, where she's been known as the champion for 25 years. She lives alone and keeps up a full-time office position at a local electronics plant. All her cooking and preserving happen in spare time. That often means the small hours of the morning. There's a special pride that goes with the making of pocketbook rolls. Mrs. Curts thought up this variation of her prize-winning biscuits, and her husband always loved them in their happy years together. He was really her inspiration. The two met at the old Tri-State Fair here in Burlington. He was a leading livestock and agricultural exhibitor, and his future wife a culinary exhibitor. Theirs was indeed a blue ribbon marriage. Here Mrs. Curts makes a dough of 2 cups of sifted flour, a half teaspoon of salt, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 3/4 of a cup of milk, and 1 tablespoon of shortening. She works in the shortening and adds milk gradually until a soft dough is formed. She kneads lightly for 2 to 3 minutes. Then the dough is rolled into 1/4 inch thickness and cut with a biscuit cutter. Mrs. Curts butters each future pocketbook roll, folds it double, and presses the edges together neatly. The rolls go into a greased pan, and their tops are brushed with butter. The oven is 450 degrees preheated for 15 to 20 minutes of baking. See, don't they look like little purses, Mrs. Curts asks. While Mrs. Curts is truly hospitable, everyone doesn't get to look over her shoulder as she prepares her specialties. Her final demonstration will be an unusual and complex one, black walnut Christmas bread. First, she drains carefully 3/4 of a cup of chopped maraschino cherries. Then she creams together a 1/2 cup of shortening and 3/4 of a cup of sugar until fluffy. She beats 2 eggs and stirs them in well. Now she sifts together 3 cups of sifted enriched flour, 4 teaspoons of baking powder, and 1 teaspoon of salt. The cherries and nuts are dredged in a 1/4 cup of flour. Alternately, she adds the flour and 1 1/4 cups of milk to the creamed mixture. Then Mrs. Curts stirs in the cherries and nuts. It all goes into a 5 by 9 inch greased loaf pan. And then to a 350-degree preheated oven for about an hour. The result is a very Merry Christmas. This is how Mrs. Fred Curts of Burlington, Iowa, spends her free time. The ribbons pile up through the years to decorate wall hangings, scrapbooks, or simply lie loosely in boxes. How many are there? Mrs. Curts has won more than 2,500 ribbons for her excellence in the kitchen. More than 1,500 of them blue ribbons. Judges all over America find her work to be superior in texture, color, appearance, and taste. It's taken her 25 years, and she's loved every minute of it.